Hi there, my name is Gary Davis and I'm a technical specialist with the Media and Entertainment Group at Autodesk. In this video we're going to be taking a look at the new Autodesk Smoke 2013, and we're going to have an emphasis around the product specifically for use with 3D artists and 3D production pipelines. As the slide here says, this is basically a creative media hub for both compositing and nonlinear editing in one, and it's an exciting new release. I'm also got some URLs up there. You can check out my blog at area.autodesk.com, and I'm also on Twitter at GaryDVisualZ. Today we're going to be looking at Smoke 2013, and this is a public release version 4, and I wanted to point out that this is actually a public trial or public beta, if you will. You can kind of think of that. We're actually not calling it a beta as much as a public trial. This is version 4 that I will be recording with, and this is publicly available for free through December 2012. So here's some special links. The first two are probably the most important, where you can actually download the trial and also get a lot of free tutorial videos out there on the likes of the Learning Channel at YouTube, as well as Twitter and Facebook links. In this video, like I said, we're going to be focusing on the use of Autodesk Smoke 2013 for 3D artists, and I'm not going to handhold you through every one of these points here, but some of the ones I really wanted to point out and immediately reiterate is that first one, is that Smoke brings nonlinear editing and compositing into one environment like I've never seen before. I have a 3D background, and I'm going to be using assets in this presentation rendered out of 3ds Max and Mental Ray, but this will be applicable to use from any rendered assets coming out of any 3D animation software. But again, I come from a 3D background, and I've done a lot of compositing work as well. Ultimately, everything kind of is about story, and it comes together in a nonlinear edit. And while I consider myself a capable editor, I'm not much of like a full-blown feature film kind of editor. So for me as a 3D artist, having a compositing and nonlinear editing environment in one place is really liberating, because 3D is quite a bit to take in, let alone all the plugins that are out there. So if I can only have maybe one other application where everything kind of comes together, and that's really what Smoke 2013 has done for me. And we're going to see a little bit more about why it does this, both nonlinear editing and node-based or layer-based compositing in one environment. And that's the next point, is that it is both node and layer-based. So if you're coming from something like Photoshop or After Effects and have a layer-based background approach to building things, you're going to be perfectly comfortable in Smoke, as well as if you come from a node-based compositor such as Shake or Nuke, or even back to Combustion or something like that. Node-based workflows are also totally found inside of Smoke, and you can combine those and create a hybrid workflow. Jumping ahead there, we've got all the great tools, keying, tracking, masking, color correction. There is a full audio tool set we'll get a glimpse of here in a minute. Painting, and then down to some really nice features specific to 3D is support for full floating point OpenEXR pipelines. And we're going to see how we can bring in some assets in a couple of different ways that are OpenEXR. And then we also have newly in this release of 2013, we can work either in a compressed workflow or an uncompressed workflow. So ProRes or different types of flavors of ProRes, or you can work with full 444 uncompressed workflows for pristine work. And there also is a full stereoscopic tool set. Now, in preparing this presentation today, I realized that there is a lot to cover, and I'll admit that this is probably not going to hit everything that I want to. I have a lot of assets created for this presentation, and so this will probably more than realistically be part one, more than likely be part one of many where I focus on Autodesk Smoke for 3D artists. Before I get into the application, I wanted to show you a few links and share these with you. The assets that I'm going to be using today are from a short film called Gwen and Dave. And for time's sake, I'm not going to play this whole thing down, but you can see here it's out on YouTube. This is a short film that was created by Hatch Studios, and we'd really like to thank them. Great assets, again, created with 3ds Max using the Mental Ray rendering engine. Rendered all out as floating point OpenEXRs. Just a great little short film that we had put together for our demonstration purposes, and we'd like to thank them. Moving along to the next link, I'd like to point out that once again and reiterate that our area website is a huge community for Autodesk users, and hopefully everybody already knows that's listening to this. Two biggies to point out specific to Smoke. One is that we have forums, and under Smoke for Mac OS X, you're going to see this Smoke 2013 forum. Now, this is a forum, as I mentioned, there's a free public trial currently available for Smoke 2013, and this is where you can give feedback to both the community as well as Autodesk. And if you come up under here under products and we drop down to Smoke, there's some information about Smoke as well as some nice links and community downloads and so on. But maybe the most important one is this free trial. And if you go here, you can see that we can download the free trial. Currently, as of this recording, is version 4, and this is the exact version I will be using today for this recording and for this presentation. But I just wanted to really reiterate again, this is going to be available until December of 2012. So get out there, try it. There's tons of stuff that you can do, whether you're shooting on cameras or rendering assets, as I am today from a 3D animation software. Couple of other things. When I was new to Smoke myself, I got a couple of things that helped me out. A lot of help from my colleagues at work. If you're a Final Cut user, there is a preference inside of Smoke where you can set up your hotkeys to be a Final Cut. We also have, if I just kind of jump through here to this previous links, there's Smoke keyboards that you can buy, and I'm actually using one on my Mac laptop, and this actually shows you a lot of the different functions of Smoke. So you can opt within the application, and it's just a user preference, to be using Final Cut hotkeys or the Smoke default hotkeys. I am using the Smoke default hotkeys, which, as you can see here, not really, 6 one way, half dozen the other if you're going to choose one or the other. But I just wanted to make that clear. If you are coming from an editorial background and know the Final Cut hotkeys, you can get away with using those. And again, I am using the Smoke hotkeys, so I find this keyboard really indispensable, and I've come to love this thing and take it with me for any of my demonstration purposes. And then lastly, this link over here I'll show you is under Autodesk.com. I did a Google search for this actually. Let me just go back one. I did a Google search for 3ds Max FBX compatibility chart, and when I do that, it was the very first link, and here's compatibility charts for 3ds Max, Maya, Motion Builder, Mudbox, and Softimage. And if you just look at this chart, this is probably going to be one of those things that I'll get to in more depth, in a greater depth, in a second video in a later time. But I really wanted to point this out for 3D artists. This is invaluable. What this is basically a chart, and to just kind of scroll down here, and let's maybe stick to the first page. Here's 3ds Max and all these features that are inside of 3ds Max. And if I'm going to output an FBX file, that's a 3D model with optional embedded textures, bone systems, deforming geometries, all kinds of good stuff. It's not just like passing a model along to another package. But look over in this last column over here, you have Smoke and Flame. And what that allows is for 3ds Max or Maya or Softimage or other applications to use the FBX file format to really get a lot of information over to your compositing environment. And in fact, Smoke and Flame share a module called Action, which is a 3D world, if you will, where you can bring in actual geometry and textures and lights and cameras and so on. So this isn't just a matter of compositing two-dimensional static images or moving images inside of Smoke's 3D compositing environment called Action. You can actually do a lot more than that, and we'll take a brief look at that today, but that'll be also explored in further videos. So here we are in the Smoke timeline, and I've actually intentionally set this up a little bit different than the typical default. As you can see here, we're scrubbing through a basic nonlinear editing session, and we've got our Autodesk tools that are actually showing. If I play this down, you way of working, but you can see that we've got our pretty traditional nonlinear editing down at the bottom here. Now up at the top, I mentioned we have a full-blown nonlinear editing and compositing environment in one. This won't be a real in-depth talk about audio, but I wanted to show you that these tools are in fact there. And you can see here we've got a lot of different audio tracks in this particular file. We've got background noise and music and all kinds of sound effects and so on. And then here's our basic shots coming from a nonlinear editing session. And then down here we've also got our credit rolls that were done in Smoke. So it's a full-blown nonlinear editing system, like I said. Now I'm going to put the interface back to the way that I like it, but I just wanted to show you that there are some options here. I'm going to turn off the audio desk, and you can see now that I can actually resize this up or down depending on what I'm doing. You also have the ability to work over here with a source and record view, much in the same way you would in a typical, more traditional nonlinear editor. I like working with a single view. There's personal preference. And then the one last thing that I'm going to do over here is way down here, and this has moved around over the few public releases that have been out here. But right now I have this tab that says hidden, and if I unhide it, what I've got here over on the left is this thing we call the media library. And this is, as you can see here, I've got a lot of different things already imported and organized into bins, if you want to call them that. These are just folders or directory structures. And I have one more option down here. Right now you can see I have it set to tall. If I turn off tall, then you can see that our timeline is actually taking more space horizontally, and then our media library is shortened up there. So you can switch that between, you know, tall and not. I like it to be tall, and then I'm going to hit Control H occasionally throughout the presentation to be hiding that and unhiding it. So again, Control H, and I'm just hiding and unhiding this on the left. And those hotkeys, if you're not familiar with them, are visible right here. So this is the way that I typically like to work. And then what I'm also going to introduce you to or point out down here at the very bottom of the interface are these different tabs. And in previous releases of the public release, there was only 2 down here. So as these public trials have been, you know, upgraded and re-released, you know, kind of weeks later or a month later, more tools have obviously been added. So if you're not looking at a version of Smoke that has 4 tabs, then you're not using the current public release version 4 that I am. So over here in the left tab, we're going to go to this what's called the Media Hub, and the Media Hub is where I can browse the folders. Now I'm going to go quickly through this, but I wanted to point out some specific functions of bringing in assets that are specific to 3D artists, like rendered frames. Quickly, if I look at the home button here, you can see I've got all my drives and my network shares and my NAS and all that good stuff. I'm going to go to a local storage media, this work project, One and Dave Master, and I've got my shots rendered here. And these are all the different shots. If I'm just going to use shot 4 as an example here, and you can see that it's loading things up. If I single click on a clip here, it just selects it. But if I double click, it's actually bringing up a little player here on the left, and you can see that I can just scrub this and actually get important information that this is in fact an OpenEXR image sequence. The resolution is 1080p. It's 16-bit half float. And it's also 24 frames per second. So a lot of good information. And again, as I click through different clips here, you can see that I've got a nice little player, and I can scrub these and even set in and out points if I wanted to. That might be more of an editorial thing if you're using footage from the real world, but certainly not limiting you to setting in and out points on CG rendered assets either. Now, one thing I like to do as a 3D artist, I kind of typically don't think in terms of SMPTE timecode. I think in terms of frames for each shot. So one preference that you can do is I'm going to just go into the preferences for user interface, and I'll talk about a few in here. The first one that I like to change is by working under user interface display and having it be set to frame. Now I'll come back into the preferences real quick, but if I exit out of here, notice that this is now working in frames, and you can see that each of these clips over here is 203 frames, or rather is 1 to 204 for a total of 203. So you can see here I can, you know, play these down. A couple more, if I go back into our preferences here, there's a couple more that I'd like to point out. One of them is under Backburner. So if you're familiar with Backburner, it's the network rendering management software. It's been coming with 3ds Max for many years. It also is included with Maya and Softimage. I have several different Backburner instances on my network here. And so what I've got is I want to have the Backburner manager inside of Smoke pointing typically to the Backburner manager within itself. So this is in fact pointing to the Gary D Mac, which is the name of the machine that I'm on. But I also have a Windows render farm set up in my facility, in my studio, and I don't want to point to that. Now that's just getting a little bit more technical than I probably need to, but I'm just pointing out that Backburner is a part of Smoke, and in the background a lot of the tasks that you do, including importing and exporting, are going to be using Backburner. You don't want to get your render farms mixed up. The last one over here that I'll show you is under the timeline tab, and this is one, it's certainly an option that you can do, and there is frame-based render or track-based render here. Now what I'm going to choose is frame-based render, and the difference is, and I'll kind of just leave it on frame-based render, but just to show you that's just a toggle. Frame-based render, what that does is in the timeline, if I have several different clips such as this, and you can see here I have 2 layers, a frame-based render means that it's going to render all the layers, whether you're talking about layer-based timeline compositing or, as we see in a moment, node-based. But it's going to render all of the frame, right now I'm on frame 597. It's going to render all of frame 597 before it moves to the very next frame of 598, as opposed to a track-based render, which would render everything on this layer right here and then continue to render everything on this layer. And the reason I choose frame-based render is that if I'm in the middle of something and I push render right here, and this is actually already rendered, but if I render, and let's say for example it was just rendering and rendering and rendering, and I wanted to see it up to that point, well, I could just stop Smoke from rendering just by clicking anywhere in the interface, and then it's actually just going to allow me to see up until that point. So say for example I have a 100 frame clip and I want to only render the first 20 frames to get an idea of how things are progressing. That's why I optionally choose in the user preferences to work with a frame-based render. Now jumping back into the Media Hub, what I can do is actually bring in these clips in several different ways. Now I'll just point out here there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 clips here, and they all have this little tab here that says multi, and I'm just going to focus on this guy right here of our, the main beauty pass of our character and the car. So I have this clip right here, immediately reiterating there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 clips in this directory. But if I double click on that multi, what you're going to see is an actual breakout. Whoops, and let me see if I can get my cursor to act a little better. Let me switch Wacom pens there. There we go. So I double clicked on multi, and now what I did was break out the RGB and the alpha over here. So if you look at this right here, this is our alpha channel for that clip. And typically as a 3D animator, I want the red, green, blue, and alpha to all kind of ride along. But there's a lot of workflows within Smoke and Flame actually that can accommodate the splitting out of these alpha channels, and you can do that by option. It's again completely your choice depending on how you want to work. I'm going to double click this multi-clip back again and sort of put it back into red, green, blue, and alpha all riding together, and I'm going to want these clips to be what are called multi-channel clips. So down here in the general import options, I'm going to always, in my case, this isn't carved in stone, but this is my personal preference, I do want to create a multi-channel clip. So when something has an alpha channel, it's going to bring that in. Now creating project media, it just means if you want to optionally create project media, that means it's going to cache a version of your clips local to the frame store that you created or you assigned when you installed Smoke. If you do not create project media, then you're just going to be pointing back to the real assets on your hard drives, and those can be any types of drives. They can be anywhere on your network. And once you start doing things like processing color corrections or composites, those will become project media. But again, this is more of a thing for performance. I typically will create project media because I have a nice RAID array connected to my machine, nice Thunderbolt storage array. So in my case, I am going to create project media, and I am going to create a multi-channel clip. Some other options here, you could choose to work at a different bit depth. I'm going to be saying get the actual bit depth from the source, which in my case is floating point. And then there are some other options here. One that I really like to point out is this frame rate. So what you can do is actually force a frame rate on something, and one of the things that I've done a lot is I render 720p animations, and I want them to be either 23:9 or 24, and because of the resolution of 1280 by 720p, Smoke often assumes that it's a 59:9 clip, as the real world would be like maybe from P2 cameras or something like that for shooting higher frame rates at 720p. Well, a lot of times for 3D animation, I'm rendering at 720p, but I want to force a frame rate of either 23:9 or 24. So that's an important one to point out, depending on the assets that you're using. So in this case, I'll say auto frame rate. Our clips are in fact 1920, 1080, 24p, as is our project that we're working in, so we're good to go. And now I think we're good to go over here. Lastly, what I'm going to show you is that if I roll this up, I can actually bring all these clips in either one at a time simply by dragging and dropping them, or I can use the entire directory structure. So right here we're looking at, there's I think 12 shots here, and I'm going to go into shot 4 or 040 and just drag and drop this into our media library. So what that's doing is it's bringing that in. Here's our untitled folder. We could maybe call that import 040. And there it is. And now we can go into our timeline. And if I just tap the T key, what I'm going to do is actually get to the thumbnail view and actually double click on that. And I'm going to get to a thumbnail view of what we call the desktop. And the desktop is really fantastic because it's an area that you can sort of freely think. And I like to work on the desktop in what I call organized chaos. And here I could maybe say, here's our background, here's our interior, and here's an ambient occlusion. These are going to get composited up like that. And you can see that I can kind of work in a way similar to how a card dealer in Vegas might just kind of throw cards around on a table. So here we've got our beauty pass. Here's an ambient occlusion that's going to go over it. And then we have a rim light on our character right here. So this is almost the fundamental layout of our basic comp. We've got these three that are kind of acting as one, and these three that are kind of our background. So we've got a basic foreground background comp. We've already brought them in as multi-channel clips, and now what we want to do is go ahead and start creating a timeline for that. So to do that, I'm going to create a sequence right in our folder here, and I'm just noticing that it's 204 frames again. If I wasn't sure of the resolution or the frame rate, because I just imported this, I know I know what it is, but I can hold down the Alt key and actually just hover over these clips, and you can see that these are in fact revealing some metadata in this. It's 1920 by 1080, it's 16-bit half float, and it is in fact 24 frames per second. So what I can do is just come over here and right click, and I say I want to create a new sequence, and let's call this shot 04. And this is going to be a timeline, not yet a composite, so you'll see that in a minute. I want to just check that this is only this is a monoscopic. Another session will be looking into stereoscopy in depth. This is going to be 1920 1080. I'll leave it at 8-bit for now, even though our footage is floating point, just to help the recording of this session a little bit along. And then the duration is in fact 204. Now one thing to notice here, I just typed in 204 and it landed at 52. One thing you can do in this little calculator is switch between time code and frames. Remember, just a second ago we changed our user preferences to be using frames, but anywhere you're entering time information with this calculator, you can kind of switch between. So I'm going to be in frames, type in our, let's clear it, 204, whoops, sorry. Let's do this again, 204, I'm typing with a pen, hit enter. So let's double check, shot 04, 204 frames, 8-bit, 1080, let's go create it, and we have our shot right here. So if I double click on this, you can see we've got multiple timelines that are now open. This is our assembly that we were looking at the entire clip, and right here is a tab for our empty shot 04. Well, we don't have any audio, and I actually made the mistake of creating some audio, but I'm just going to show you that I can just drag and drop that down, and now I don't have any audio in here. So what I'm going to do is actually tap the T key to switch back to a thumbnail view. This is actually the output of shot 04, so if you're wondering where that extra thumbnail came from, it's just the actual output, which is blank right now. And here's our empty timeline. So what I want to do is create a composite ultimately, and you can easily see that it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 layers. So what I'm going to do is very simply just drag and drop these down into the timeline. I have Ripple and Snap enabled over here, which are very straightforward nonlinear editing tools. Snap I'm going to leave on, and the nice thing about Snap is actually snapping to either the end or the midpoint, or it kind of is intelligent the way that it's snapping. So here's our background, and I'm just going to quickly do these one at a time. You can see that this will snap too. It also created a new layer there, and I'm just doing these in the order that I know I kind of threw them together on the desktop. So we've got 3 layers there, and then we've got our beauty pass, and again it's just adding up, it's making new layers for me. It's making a new layer for me there. And then the last one, actually, instead of just automatically making a new layer, I'll just show you the manual way to do that. If you want to create a new layer in here, what you can do is, and I'll point back to this in a second, but you can use the arrow keys on the keyboard and do what's called the focus. And this little horizontal hash mark right there is actually telling me where I will create a new video track above. So I just created a new empty video track. I can take this last little layer here and drop it right in. So you can see that you can create those manually or automatically. So here we've got our timeline. I'm just going to tap the escape key, and now you're going to see the actual comp. Now looking at this, you can see that we've got our character's rim light. And if I once again use the arrow keys to change this focus to go down one level, you can see that there's our ambient occlusion render of our character. If I take this down one more level, it's showing me the output of each of these layers. And it's actually showing me the composite. So right now what we're technically looking at is the background, the environment, and the ambient occlusion of the environment. But you might be asking yourself, why am I looking at the ambient occlusion in a it's all white like a normal ambient occlusion. It's not really being composited yet. The reason for that is that we brought these clips in, and my eye is a little bit trained to look for this, but these clips are actually a blue color, and that means that these are contained. And you'll remember back in the Media Hub, when we imported these clips, we did what's called a multi-channel clip. And that means, if I go back to our timeline, let's say, for example, we look at this ambient occlusion pass, or let's make it a little bit clearer. Let's look at our beauty pass. And again, I'm using the arrow keys on my keyboard. I'm focusing on this particular shot right here. Whoops, let me backpedal a little bit. So we're focusing on just this layer right here, which is our beauty pass of our character. If I double click on that, we're actually looking inside of what's called a container, and I can look at the focus here, and it might be hard to see at this screen grabbed resized resolution, but if I look, here's the beauty pass, and if I arrow up, here's our alpha. So there's our RGB and alpha put together inside of this container. So I can exit out of the container just by closing that down, and then we're back to just looking at the single shot. So all these clips came in with an alpha channel embedded into it as a contained clip. So it's really red, green, blue, and alpha all riding together. But to access that, what we need to do, and I'm just going to select all these clips, is I'm going to apply what's called a timeline effect to these clips. So up here you can see we have an effects tool, and we'll be getting into Connect Effects in a second, which is our node-based compositing environment. But before we do that, you can apply very common effects to each clip in your editorial timeline. So here we've got things like time warp, resizing, text, our Academy Award winning color corrector, which is also the color warper. You have an option in there. Sparks, which are third-party plugins, and I won't be using any today. Blending, wipes, or transition. And then the last one over here is a powerful little sucker called axis. I'm just going to apply an axis to every single one of these by having them all selected. And it just actually went through and applied that axis. Now what that did, and if I just select one of these, let's go down and look at the very bottom layer. So here's our background. And if I look up one, now you can see through that sky, and the alpha channel that was embedded into this clip right here is actually visible. So we're getting a good composite. If I take this focus and I go up one, now we're seeing our ambient occlusion, and we can still see through the alpha. However, you may or may not be aware that ambient occlusion typically needs a transfer mode or blending mode called multiply. So the axis tool gives us some tools right in here for things like position, and I don't want to do this, but I'll show you that I could reposition this if I wanted to. Holding down Control and clicking in there resets that value. I could also do a rotation on this layer, which I don't want to do, but just to show you, and that we have some basic functions for translation and position and so on. But here's also our access to our blending modes. So if I change this to multiply, you're going to see our ambient occlusion get composited over the background. And if I look at before and after, and I'll keep going back and forth here, there's before without ambient occlusion, and there's our ambient occlusion comped over. So now when I go up a layer, we've got our character comped in. Go up one more, and we've got our ambient occlusion. This guy just needs to be set to multiply very quickly. And then lastly, we've got our rim light, and instead of a multiply transfer mode, this one is actually using a one called simple additive, which means that you're using a additive transfer mode and including the alpha channel. So you can see that we've got all of those in there now. And as I go through, there's our background, and now working our way up, we've got the interior with ambient occlusion, beauty pass with ambient occlusion, and our rim light. So that's a basic timeline comp. And what we can do next is actually, and optionally, process this down. If I just selected all of these and hit render, and I'm going to go ahead and pause this down and show you what the results are. So now all these layers have been composited and rendered out, and they're part of our local frame store, and you can see that we get nice real-time playback if I go ahead and hit my hotkey V for play, using again the Smoke hotkeys, and you can see that we've got our composite. I can also optionally go to full screen here and do a full screen playback. I don't know how well that's going to perform using the capture software, but you get the idea. I can also go through, and here's our old assembly of the entire nonlinear edit, and you can see that when we're full screen we can flip-flop between several, and I'll go back out. So here's our shot, but the problem with this is, so we're looking at shot 04, and it is in fact, just to remind you, right up here. If we go back to our assembly where we're looking at the entire nonlinear edit, and let's say we were going to put this right after our end credits. So I'm just going to grab right in here and just pull down to zoom out a little bit and maybe pan over. So if we were going to just put this at the end, and I could even hotkey down to the very end here using my Z and X for previous and next transition. But if I grab this, you'll notice that if I just drag and drop this down here, it's kind of wanting to put 6 layers in there. So this, while this is nice and it's a single clip up here as shot 04, if we look at it, it's kind of making sense that it is in fact 6 layers in the timeline. So you can obviously see that this kind of becomes a little bit cumbersome. What I'm going to do is actually contain this into, instead of a container, what we're going to do is create a composite out of this, and I can just select all 6 layers here, and instead of coming under effects and adding one of these timeline effects, what we can do is say create a connect effects, and actually optionally, and this is very important, generate a composite. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 layers. We did our axis effect to give some transfer modes or blending modes that we already set up. And now when I say go ahead and create a connect effects, now this is where the real power and beauty of Smoke's node-based compositing environment called connect effects comes into play. And here you can see that if we zoom back out, oops, and I got some kind of display issue going on over there on the right. Let's see if I can rectify that. If I come through here, yeah, that was just by maybe hopefully the capturing software. If I come through here, you can see that what we did was we created a node-based environment. I'm going to hit Control H to hide this whole area on our left to give us some more screen real estate. And we've got this sort of split screen that you can see I can easily resize. So on the left we have a node-based compositing environment, and on the right we have our output. Now this is where we have lots of different tools available, and you can see down here we have a tool bin, and these are actually optionally categorized into into just that, tabs of categories, or we can look at all the nodes. And to just show you a real basic one here, I'm just going to grab our color corrector. If you don't want to go digging in through all of these, what you can do, like say for example, I know I want to hit the color corrector, I'm just going to tap the C key, and it's filtering me to all the nodes or tools that just start with the letter C. So if I just do a real obvious one, I'm just going to drag and drop this out here and kind of show you how this works. I'm holding the space bar and control to zoom, and the space bar to pan around. Again, I'm using Smoke's hotkeys, so those might not be the same for you if you've set your user up using Final Cut hotkeys. If I double click on the color corrector, here's the very old school Academy Award winning wonderful color corrector, and I'm doing very extreme color corrections, but you can see by what I'm doing it's actually happening downstream, as is indicated by all of this. So what Connect Effects is a node-based compositing environment per shot in your timeline. So I've got all these clips that were brought in, and you can see there's all of our ambient occlusions and all of our layers. These layers were put together into a node called Action, which is our 3D compositing environment. And this is one that we could spend hours and hours discussing. I'm going to get into it a little bit more here in a minute, or right now. But Action is one I want you to be very aware that this is the full-blown 3D compositing environment, and there's a lot that can happen inside of Action. And because there's a lot that can happen inside of Action, unlike a tool like the color corrector where you can come down here and just edit away, or let's say for example I go back to effects and I add another second obvious one called blur, and let's just really blur the heck out of this so you can see what's going on. So here we've got our Action output, which is nice and clean composited. We've got our color corrected version, and we've got our blurred version, all happening in a chain. But unlike blur and color corrector, like I said, Action has a heck of a lot going on in it. So it's got all these different tabs for moving things around, adding lights and so on. Now you'll notice if I come back out here and I'm working, there's an effects node bin, and these are all tools that you can do at the pixel processing level right here in the Connect Effects schematic. But Action, if I double click on it, it has its own tools because, again, just to immediately repeat myself, it's a full-blown 3D compositing environment. And because of that, what you can opt to do is come over here and say that I want to look at the schematic just for this Action node. So if I look at the Action schematic, now what we're looking at is the inside of that 3D environment. And instead of a pixel flow of information, this actually shows you more of a relationship between different nodes. And we're going to get into this a little bit more in depth a little bit later, but I just wanted to point out that there's a lot going on inside of Action, and all this information was automatically created for us back when we selected our 6 layers and we created a Connect Effects workflow. So for now, I'm just going to go back out to our Connect Effects schematic, and we were just inside of that single node. So you can see that there's a real power as a 3D artist to have a full 3D compositing environment, that you're comfortable with doing things like lights and lens flares and FBX models and so on. But we'll get to that later. For now, I just want to concentrate on this pixel flow of information, and I'm just going to actually grab these and drag them off the screen down here and just kind of throw them out. And just to show you, actually, let me slow down a little bit there. There's actually, I hope you can see this in the capture, a little recycle trash can icon down here, and you'll get in the habit of just kind of swiping down and throwing things away. But let's say, for example, we wanted to do one last one, and I'll do one called damage. So I'm going to type D, bring up our damage node. Another little nice hotkey here that you can use if you have a tool selected. A lot of these are color coded, and there's a lot of good videos. I mentioned earlier in this video that there's tons of YouTube videos about the basics of smoke. But just to show you some of the things here, we've got a foreground input and a matte input are typically red and blue, and green is a background. So you have foreground, background, and matte is RGB, or front back matte is red, green, blue. And that's a nice little thing you can start ingraining into your head. So this is going to say I want yellow as the output to be the foreground in a damage node, and I want the output of that damage node to be the output of our entire shot. Now I'm going to come right back to this damage node, but I want to kind of bounce around here intentionally. This node right here is very special, and it has this little icon indicating that it's the output. This, whatever happens in this schematic view, and you can obviously do a lot of different compositing functions in here. Whatever happens in here, the very end result is always going to be one output, and that output you can get back out to by saying exit Connect Effects, and now we're going back out to the timeline, and you'll notice instead of our 6 layers now we only have 1. So I could very easily just throw out these others. I don't need them anymore. We have our one shot. If I scrub, it's going to say it's unrendered because I haven't processed this yet, but it very quickly composites the still frame. And this is where I'll remind you back in my preferences that I have a frame-based rendering, and this is another reason why I like that. So here we've got our shot, and at any time, if I bring up our media library, sorry about that, if I go out and back to our assembly, now you can see that it's a lot easier for me to bring one clip in, and now all of these you can see have the same color. Every single one of these clips has its own compositing environment that I can at any time get to by selecting the clip, going into Connect Effects, and entering its editor. So very quickly you can see the power of having this node-based compositing environment on every single shot, and this is where I immediately want to reiterate and just really drive this home, that you have a node-based compositing environment and a nonlinear editing environment in one, and it's completely non-destructive. So that it's a very liberating experience, and you can work in a very sort of flippant way and try a lot of different things, and you can load and save setups for each of these Connect Effects. So it's very non-destructive. And in fact, one other thing that you can do, if I just throw that clip away and go back to our single shot, even if I want to work on this shot right here, which is our clip right here, I could have shot 4, and this is called CFX begin, and then just come through here and make a duplicate of it by right-clicking and saying, let's go duplicate it. I've got 2. So we're making versions of this, and this might be testing, or whatever you want to call it. So we've got our original right here, and then we've got our testing, and I could come and double click on that. So here's the one that we were working on. Here's the other one, and I can go into that and really just kind of get crazy and try different things and, you know, do whatever. So now that's what we're going to do. We're back to this damage node. Damage is a fun one. I'm going to just double click on that, and you can see that the output hasn't really done anything yet because we haven't really turned on all these different tools. And so just by selecting these, you can see that we've got tools over here. Let's just focus on one that's very popular called Vignette. Now Vignette, you don't see anything. I'm not really turning it on yet, and that's where these little blue LEDs are. And now you can actually obviously see this nice vignette over here. I'm going to Control H, hide my tool or my bins over there. And now we're looking at the damage node, and here you can see that I can control the scale of our vignette. maybe just dial back that transparency a little bit so it's not quite as intense. And you can see that we can get a start to do nice look development on this thing and actually reuse these as much as you want. Now, a lot of these tools, including damage, have some presets. So here, for example, I could say, let's load in a preset, and do you want to confirm this? Yes. This is a 70s sort of look. Let's go to bad projector, and this is actually kind of a fun one. If I hit play on this, there's actually little hairs in the screen and all kinds of flickering and jittering, and this also has a vignette. So this isn't actually rendering through, it's just processing one frame at a time as I'm playing back and recording. So there's a lot going on under the hood, but you can see that this tool, like damage, is a very worthwhile tool because you can record your own presets, or you can come through and use a preset as a starting point and then create your own looks. To just throw out the damage tool, I'm going to drag and drop that down and actually show you one more, which is called Stylize. So just tap down here, tap the letter S. Stylize is another very powerful tool for look development. I'm just going to drag and drop that out here. Stylize, I'm going to wire in to the output. There we go. And now Stylize, you can see, immediately starts to do some crazy stuff. We've got a lot of different presets in here for things like cartoon looks. By holding down the Alt key, by the way, you can actually just get rid of that warning and just kind of flip through these presets. But I'm not going to go through all these. You can see that there's lots of different presets in here. Comic book, looks for manga. What I'm going to do is actually create one from scratch very briefly and just show you there's some more for oil paint. But what I'm doing with these presets is actually just creating different layered looks up here. So if I just delete these, delete, let's just make one from scratch. What you can do is add these effects. So if I say, let's, in the Stylize node, add an effect, and this is, instead of a drawing, let's maybe do a colored smudge look. So you can see that there's a colored smudge. How much smudging do we want? You can control that interactively right in the viewport. And then I could maybe add another layer to kind of do a cartoon look on this and say, how about sharp outlines? That looks good. And if I have sharp outlines selected, we have transfer modes or blending modes, maybe multiply or maybe additive. Let's put it back to multiply like that. And we also have things for like the threshold of where that cartoon outline is going to look. So very easily the Stylize node can be used to create very interesting looks, whether you're going for realism or non-photorealism or really out there with like chalk and charcoal and so on. So lots of different looks. I'm going to exit back out to the desktop now, and just to remind you, we were working in a non-destructive manner that whole time, and we have the one that we never messed around with over here, and we have our final sort of cartoon look over there. So lots of different options that you can do within Connect Effects just at the pixel level without doing 3D compositing. In this next example, I want to show you a couple of different things that you can do. You don't have to do 3D compositing, and here I have a timeline. You can see I'm doing the focus once again, and we have our background of our junkyard, or more importantly our sky, our midground, and our foreground of our character. Now once again, I'm going to just select all these, go ahead and create a Connect Effects, and it's going to once again do what it did before. Let me hide our bins over there, and it's going to create our 3-layer action module. So what we're going to do in this case is, instead of doing 3D compositing, and you can see there's nothing wrong with 3D compositing, but a lot of people are more akin to working in a 2D compositing way of working. So if I just throw out action and start to think, let's have this over this over this, and those are kind of the layers that we're going to do. You also have the ability to work with some very simple 2D compositing tools. One of these is called the LogicOp, and I really like this one because if you double click on it, there's not a lot to it. And here I could very easily just say, let's have the output of our background into the background, and into the foreground we want our clip there. So if you look here, we're getting this sort of weird blending mode, and that is in fact an additive blending mode. If I just change this down to blend, we're getting our background with our foreground composited over it. So very simple, nice way of working. One thing you'll notice is that the sky isn't exactly showing through here, and that's where the output of the matte is going to come into play here. So in every one of these clips, remember we did a container in the beginning, and so there's a RGB information and alpha or matte coming out of here. So the last thing we need in this LogicOp is the matte of our foreground. And I'll remind you that we have red, green, blue, excuse me, is front, back, and matte. So now we've got our background with our foreground composited over it, and we can continue to work that way and just grab another LogicOp, take the output of this as the background, our character is the foreground, and we'll use his matte. And once again, double click the LogicOp and change our blending mode to just blend. So we're not using we're not doing ambient occlusion or anything like that here, but we certainly could, and we have all of our blending modes. And in this case, I'm just going to be finished there and just kind of pop that through to our end result. So we've got our comp happening up very quickly here. So we've got background over sky and our character. So very simple, straightforward 2D compositing workflow is available inside of Smoke as well. And the next thing I'm going to show you is actually a nice little tip and trick that I like to do. One of them is for doing depth of field or motion blur. And first I'm going to do a motion blur effect that I like to do a lot. And I'll show you the actual effect, and then I'll show you how to build it up from scratch. But over here I want to point out on the right that if you do have effects that you use quite often, you can actually build sets of tools that are reusable. And if I just drag this out here, you can see this is what I'm about to create. But I'll just swipe that off and kind of reveal how we made that. But I did want to point out that you can make groups and sort of rename tools over here. Now the first one I'm going to do is actually come under here, type the letter M, and we have motion analysis and motion blur. And I'm going to need both of these. Motion analysis is going to actually generate motion vectors. And I'm going to take the output of our final comp, which is this clip. Let's actually get to a frame where there's a lot of motion here. So he's really kind of moving in here. And I'm going to actually just pop this down into our motion analysis node. Now if I look at the output of our motion analysis node, it's a really wonky looking output, and it only has a couple different settings in here. One that's a little bit misleading is where it says use full resolution. That actually just means that it's doing a pixel analysis or motion analysis on every single pixel. And the default is 1/4 resolution. That doesn't mean 1/4 the quality. It just means every 4th pixel, and it's going to be a little bit faster. I actually like to, it's a personal preference, and maybe worth checking shot for shot, but I like to leave this on the default. It's a little bit faster for processing. And so what motion analysis is going to do is actually output a motion vector into our motion blur tool. And the motion blur tool is not going to work on this crazy looking motion analysis result. It's going to work on what we want to blur. So here we've got our motion analysis happening, passing vector information to our motion blur tool, and the output of which is going to be the end result. So we're going to override that and kind of rewire that. Now the blur type is going to be actually a samples. I know that these values are pretty sensitive, so I'm going to maybe say let's just do a blur value of 1 here. And you're going to see that in there, if I bypass this, and I haven't shown you this yet before, but if I turn this on and off, notice in the viewport, you can see that our character is getting quite a bit of blur applied to him, and it's basing that on the motion analysis. So now that we've got this tool that we've created and we've got our nice motion blur, one of the things that we might want to do is actually create this as a tool that we repurpose. Well, notice here, and this is again getting a little bit tricky, we've got our LogicOp here and it's got 2 outputs. And we really only, to have a tool that we repurpose, we don't want to have all these crazy multiple inputs and outputs. We'd prefer to have 1 input and 1 output. So there's this great little tool over here in this bin called Mux. And what Mux does is basically just has a single in and a single out. So what I'm going to do is kind of create an input and break these, and then it just has an output. So it's kind of a pass-through node, if you will. And then what I can do is say these 3 nodes now are a very handy little tool for creating my motion blur. Anything that I put into it is going to get motion analyzed and blurred, and the output of which can be passed along. So now what I can do is actually, I'm just going to reposition these a little bit so I can grab them easier. I can hold down the command key on my keyboard, select all these clips, and I have all 3 of them selected, and now what I can do is just drag these down to my bin, and I have a tool that I can repurpose at any time. And now this is currently named MoBlur 11, and I could rename that anything I want. But now if I just throw these tools away, and I was faced with this sort of unblurred clip, what I could do is then grab that tool, drop it into the viewport, and you can see very easily I can just drop a single input and a single output off of that, and I have my finished motion analysis and motion blur applied. So that's a nice little tip and trick for doing both 2D compositing with LogicOps as well as creating a motion blur tool and kind of repurposing that almost as might think of a macro. In this next example, I'm going to take an empty timeline and just drop a clip into it to do a motion blur, or sorry, depth of field effect. So here we've got a finished clip, and this could be a comp that we did elsewhere, and we sort of nested it down. In this case, it's just a beauty pass with no render passes or anything like that. But I'm going to immediately grab that clip and say, go in and create a connect effects on this. So we're basically going to have an empty node-based compositing environment with our single clip. Now what I can do is just drag and drop other clips in here, and in this case we're going to get a Z-depth pass or a Z-depth pass. And on this one I might want to do, I don't know, a color corrector, and you could do lots of different ways of editing or manipulating this. I want to come in here and specifically get a histogram so we can adjust sort of the range of the depth on here. And this is where floating point color or high bit depth color is going to really come into play. So I'm just adjusting the contrast using the histogram. I'm going to imagine that you're going to see some banding in this due to the capture software, but I really just want to adjust, sort of push the depth of field around on this, if you will. And now what I can do is actually use the output of that to input to a depth of field node. So if I come over here to all our nodes, tap the letter D, we get our depth of field. Now what we're going to do is apply our depth of field effect to our original clip. But the depth of field needs a secondary input, which is our Z depth or Z depth. So the color corrected version we're going to take and just wire into our depth of field. And now we have all the information. And notice one more thing to notice there, that white is close to us. In the depth of field we have an option for white being far or white being near. So let's just make sure that we have white is near. And now we come over to the wonderful depthogram tool, and I love saying that one. Somebody was having some fun up in Montreal with that. So here, the way that the depthogram works is you can see that we have our camera, and then we've got a red and blue sort of indicator here for depth, and the yellow is where we can actually Z-plot. So Z-plot, by clicking this button, I can actually drag around inside of my image, and you'll notice that there's a vertical bar kind of popping around down there in the viewport. So if I go to the far wall, it's way out here, you'll notice. And if I Z-plot along our character, that bar is actually popping way up in here. So I can actually just drag this and interactively see that in the viewport. And so yellow is kind of like where we're going to be focusing. Blue is near, obviously, and red is far. And I'm kind of watching, my eye is floating between the character up in the upper right and also the depthogram down in the bottom. So you can see there's our red and our background there. So we want our character to be kind of in focus, sort of way up here. The other thing that I like to personally do when I'm using this tool is I crank the amount of blur to just say like 30 or 40, so it's an intense amount of blur, or even more. For the sake of the presentation, I'll really just crank that. So you can see our character is in focus and our background is just completely blown out of focus. We can also adjust the focal range, and I'm just doing this focus range slider to increase the distance between our near and far values. So we can adjust not only what is considered near and far, but how blurry that will be. So it's just a really fantastic tool, and as any of you know that are 3D artists, doing depth of field like this in camera in a 3D renderer is going to just significantly hit, typically anyway, most renderers are going to take a significant hit in render time. And if this is something that I could do inside of post and just dial this back, now you'll see that that background is really just getting subtly I actually kind of like the real blurry one. In this case, I'm going to just really blur that out. Our background is incredibly blurred. There's no vignetting or anything really nasty happening on there. And then I can just, at any time, exit back out to the timeline, and we have a shot-based depth of field that we could just very simply process down and use per shot. So if you're generating a Z-depth pass, as most 3D artists are, this could be one where a single version, a single copy of Smoke would pay for itself with one project, just in the time saving of not rendering the depth of field in 3D. So that's a nice little trick for doing depth of field as a post process using a typical plain old Z-depth pass and the depthogram tool. Another little grab bag feature I thought I'd show you is for doing sort of a volumetric raise effect, and there's actually a lot of different ways to do that. But I wanted to point out an interesting tool inside of here called Matchbox. And so obviously there's a lot of different tools in here for within working in Connect Effects. And if I just filter this down to our Matchbox, Matchbox is actually an environment that you can develop your own tools in. And if I just drag this out, you're going to see that kind of smoke just vanished for a second, and it's loading all these different shaders. I don't have time to show you all of these, but there's all these kinds of different effects, warping effects, vignettes, and so on. And these are actually pixel shaders. This one right here that I'm going to point out is Z-Rays, and if I just load that up, that's actually going to load into this Matchbox, and if I double click on it now, it has a tool set up for specifically doing these functions of pixel shaders. So to be really clear about this, I'm going to throw out our depth of field and just use the Matchbox. So we have a foreground into our Matchbox, and in this case it says the front is our input 1 and our Z depth is input 2. So we'll just pop that right into input 2, and there we go. So now I'm going to take the output and pop it into our final out. So now within the Matchbox, what we can do is kind of just pick a different point in space to get these rays effects. So I'm going to kind of move it around over here, and actually before I move on, I'm going to just kind of pick a new color, and let's just sample maybe some of this yellow in our image right here. Oops, let me do that again. Let's just sample some of this yellow, and then to actually commit that, we can either click that color pot or click the OK. And now what we can do is actually just really drag this around, and you're going to see this sort of rays effect happening right through our character. And this is in fact based on the Z depth or Z depth information of our image. So if I just kind of make this look like the sun coming through our window over here, let's just maybe put it right behind the butterfly. Oops, white is near. That would actually help if I had that white is near. So now we've got the rays coming around our character, and you can see that it's a pretty interactive effect. And again, just like depth of field or motion blur, if you were to do these volumetric rays in a 3D application and get them wrong and have to redo them, typically that kind of effect is a very time-consuming hit. So just be aware of a couple of things, just to reiterate this one. This tip and trick here. Matchbox is a very powerful tool within all of these effects, and Matchbox itself has lots of different tools that you can sort of load and save. So within the Matchbox you can change the shader and actually go out and load different ones. So there's things for Z-Fog, Z-Glow, warping, vignetting, twirling, and all kinds of different convolutions and so on. So very powerful tool, and it's all animatable, so you can just kind of come through and add your own volumetric effects. And you can see it's very interactive, only happening in two-dimensional imagery, but a really nice three-dimensional effect. Well, because we ran out of time, I'm only going to show this tip of the iceberg look at 3D geometry inside of the action module. Here I am actually inside of 3ds Max, and this is a set piece from our character, the Gwen and Dave short film, and you can see I've got a very simple piece of geometry, several pieces actually, and I've got a couple of lights and a camera. So this was our shot, camera shot 03, and this was the basic view. You can see that we have a light up here, and we do in fact have a spotlight coming through our window. I'll also point out that in our material editor there's lots of different bitmaps that were used. These are just JPEGs, but support for the standard Targas and EXRs and PNGs and so on. So what we've got are standard shaders set up, and all of this is going to be exported out of 3ds Max using the FBX file format. And then if we jump over into Smoke, you can actually see that this piece of geometry is in fact loaded into our 3D environment. I'm showing it intentionally in wireframe just to show you that we are orbiting around in a full 3D environment. So this isn't just like loading in 2D geometry or 2.5D as some other compositing programs out there do. This is a full-blown 3D compositing environment with 3D FBX models coming in. Now if I turn off our wireframe overlay, you can see that we've got our character in here. And if I just switch this to our select tool and manipulate a couple of things around in here, just in closing I wanted to show you our character is in fact on a two-dimensional card, and you can see that as I orbit around or just rotate this layer around, it is in fact a 2D card. But I'll remind you that our 3D geometry is really the set that we're after here. And if I go through here and actually take this light, you can see this light right up at the very top here. There's actually a point light right here and also a spotlight. And these came over from 3ds Max in addition to all these shaders. You can see all of our textures that came across. Lots of different hierarchies of geometry came across, and I've admittedly added a few other things in here, like our character that was rendered. But what we can do over here is actually unhide some raise effects that we've got, and those are actually going to be rendered on the graphics card of this Mac workstation. And it's actually not like the previous example where we were using a Z-depth pass for doing sort of a 2D trick to look like volumetric rays. This is actually full-blown 3D volumetric rays, and if I just orbit around here, you can see that these rays are in fact happening in a full 3D environment. So we've got a lot happening right in here on the graphics card, and we're taking full advantage of the video card and the GPUs as well as the CPUs. And if I zoom out here, you'll see a little bit more, and it's going to kind of be a wide angle and look a little bit weird because we're seeing it at an angle that it's not intended to be. But once again, if I just orbit around here and in closing, you can kind of see that we are in fact in a full 3D set with our 2D character, but we've got our volumetric lights, and we've got a lot of good information coming across from 3ds Max via the FBX file format. So that's going to do it for me. With that, I will promise you guys and gals some more information, a lot more to come about Smoke 2013 for the 3D artists. And with that, my name is Gary Davis, and I thank you for your time.